Hello everybody and welcome to another video in the series of exploring Theme 1's 1.2, which is all about how markets work. Now, all the previous videos were building up towards understanding a market equilibrium diagram. So demand curves, supply curves, and then market equilibrium diagrams. What we're now going to do is add another layer of complexity into these diagrams by looking at what we call indirect taxes. So we're looking now at 1.2.9 indirect taxes and subsidies. This video will focus on taxes. The next one will be looking at subsidies. Right, now, first of all, remember when we did 1.1, we said that economic systems can be either free market, planned or mixed economies. When we've been looking at supply and demand on its own and market equilibrium diagrams, we're looking there at the roles and the workings of free market economies. What we know is in most economies across the world, they will operate with a mixed economy. And that means there is a role for the government to play in the workings of the economy. So what we're going to be thinking about then is the roles of governments today by thinking about why and how they will place taxes in markets. Right, now, first things first then, what we're going to be looking at here are the impacts of something that we call an indirect tax. Now, an indirect tax is a tax levied on expenditure of goods and services. So the idea is these taxes are placed on businesses. So it's businesses that pay these taxes when people buy goods and services. Now, the business has got one of two choices really, or a combination of them. They can either place this tax completely on the customer, or they can pay it themselves, or they might split it with the customer. Now, first of all, think about some examples of indirect taxes. It could be VAT. So a lot of the things that you buy will have a VAT tax placed on them. This is often about 20% of the selling price. So that means that firms have got a 20% tax they've got to pay when they sell goods and services to you as the consumer. We also have other types of indirect taxes, which we call excise duties. And these are additional tax placed on products such as cigarettes and alcohol. Now, the idea is taxes. Why do governments place taxes on expenditure? Why do we put taxes on things that people buy? Well, really, there are two main reasons for this. One, governments need to raise tax money. So to pay for things like education, healthcare, we need to generate some form of income. And that is done partly by taxes on expenditure. But a second reason could simply be that the government want to discourage the consumption of certain goods and services. So if we deem smoking to be bad for the economy, if you place a tax on that product, we're discouraging the consumption of that product. Alcohol, exactly the same. Put a tax on alcohol, it will probably make it more expensive, and that will discourage people from consuming quite as much of it. Right, now, there are two different types of indirect taxes that you need to be aware about. We have something we call a specific tax, and we have something that we call an ad valorem tax. Now, a specific tax, first of all, is a set amount of money per unit of output. So the idea would be that we might say for every particular product that a business sells, there might be a 50p tax per unit. So everything they sell will have a 50p tax placed on it. Well, that therefore means it doesn't matter what the selling price is. If it's £1, £5, £10 or £20, there is a 50p tax that needs to be paid. Now, if you look at the first diagram by specific tax, what this will do, it would lead to a parallel inward shift in the supply curve. Think about it. What we know is that supply moves inwards due to an increase in business costs. If we were to place a 50p tax per unit on every single unit of output sold, again, it doesn't matter what the selling price is, it's the same amount of tax. So the vertical distance between the supply curves would show us what we call the tax per unit. So if I've imposed a 50p per unit tax on every unit of output sold, supply would shift from S1 to S2. And at all levels along that supply curve, that cost is exactly the same. It's 50p per unit. Now, in the right-hand side diagram, we can see the impacts of what we call an ad valorem tax. So the idea now, though, is what we're doing, rather than charging a specific amount of tax per unit sold, 50p, etc., we're now placing a percentage tax on the products sold by the business. Well, that therefore means then that as we go along the supply curve, the actual amount of tax will change based on the selling price. So, for example, at a really, really low selling price, let's say £1, a VAT of 20% tax would be 20p. But at £10, well, that would be a £2 tax. So at £100, it would be a £20 tax. So the idea is, as we move up the supply curve along S1, at a much higher price, the idea will be the overall tax paid per unit will be higher than what it would be at a much lower price. Now, what that will therefore do, when we impose an ad valorem tax in a market, we're going to get a non-parallel inward shift of the supply curve. It creates almost like a cone effect. And that is the idea that when we move along supply one, like an extension, if you like, higher price, the tax per unit paid at a higher price will be much higher than it will be at a lower price, with it being a percentage tax. Okay, right guys, what I would like to do now, please, is just to reflect on what we've done so far. So can you please write down these questions into your books? So what is an indirect tax? Why might governments impose indirect taxes in markets? And then use diagrams to help you explain the difference between a specific tax and an ad valorem tax. So what I'd like you to now do is to hit pause, put down your answers. When you're happy with your answers and you think you've got them right, hit play. But what I would say is, if you're unsure, go back, watch the previous part of the video again to make sure that you understand these answers, please. Right guys, when you're happy, hit play again and we'll carry on with the rest of the video. Right, now what we're going to be thinking about now is something that we call the incidence of tax. Now what that means is, who pays the tax? Will it be the businesses that pay the tax, or will it be the consumers that pay that tax? Because ultimately the idea is, a tax is a cost to a business when they sell goods and services. And the businesses have got ultimately some different choices to make. Do they pass on that tax to you, the consumer? In other words, if the tax is 50p per unit, a specific tax, etc., do they pass it all on to the consumer? Now, if they do that, they're running the risk, though, that demand will contract massively as the price increases. What they could do, they could absorb and pay the whole tax themselves. That would have no impact on price, but the problem that would have, it could mean that their profit margins will fall significantly. It's even possible if they paid it all themselves, they could be in a position where they're making losses, which wouldn't justify keeping the business open. What they might also decide to do is to look at sharing that cost. So the firm might absorb some of it, but also what they might do is to pass on some of it to the consumer. Right, anyway, let's have a look at an example of the incidence of tax. In other words, who pays that tax? Now remember, you've got in this diagram here the workings of a specific tax. So we've got a particular cost tax for every unit sold. This could be that 50p example from the previous part of the video. Now what this will do, it will make the supply curve shift parallel inwards, like railway tracks in effect. Now the vertical distance between supply 1 and supply 2 is the tax per unit. That is how much extra cost firms have now got when they sell people goods and services. Now look at the diagram. This will shift the equilibrium point from P1Q1 to P2Q2. So what we know is the market now is operating at P2Q2. Now what that will mean is that every single unit of output sold, so from 0 all the way to Q2, there is a particular tax per unit that's got to be paid on those goods and services. The vertical distance between the supply curves is measuring the tax per unit. Now what we've got these two different shaded box areas here. We've got a green one and a yellowy kind of colour one as well. Now these two areas together will measure the total tax paid in the market on this particular good or service. Okay, so if I just add something to this diagram so you can see what I'm talking about here. Let's put this here, P3. Right, now the idea is, look at this. From P3 to P2 is the tax per unit. From P3 to Q2 is the quantity that will be sold and bought in that marketplace. Now this is just like calculating the area of a rectangle or a square. You multiply the two sides together. So if I multiply P2 to P3 by 0 to Q2, then this shaded area here will show us the total tax paid in the marketplace. Now the idea is the consumer will pay the part of it which shows the increase in price. So the price has grown from P1 to P2. So the idea will be the green box is the tax paid by the consumer. The remaining part of it is the tax which will be absorbed by the business. So what you can see here is roughly 50% of the tax will be paid by the consumer and 50% will be paid by the producer. So we can see here the incidence of tax. What proportion of the tax will be paid by the consumer and what proportion will be paid by the producer. Right, again, now what I would like to do is to take stock of what you've done so far. So what I now want you to do is to think about what we said in the previous part of this video. I want you to jot down these questions and again put down your answers. And while you're writing your answers, you need to pause the video so you've got time to complete these questions. Again, once you've completed your answers, if you're unsure with what you've done, you need to go back to the previous part of the video to make sure that you are comfortable. So hit pause now, write down your answers, and then when you're happy and you feel like you understand this properly, you've got some good answers down, hit play and we'll carry on with the next part of the video. Right guys, now I'm going to talk you through now a numerical example of who pays the tax. Now I'm going to do this by dragging across this document here. Because what we can do with this, we can use this to show exactly what is happening in this marketplace. Right, so what we've got here again is an example of a specific tax. So remember, the vertical distance between the supply curves shows us the tax per unit that's been paid. So what I can see here is the tax per unit is going to be, let me look at the numbers here, £6. Every unit of output sold, the tax per unit is £6. Now you can see that by looking at the diagram. Look at that 9 up to 15. It's a £6 tax per unit. Okay, so what this will do, it will shift in the supply curve due to that increase in cost of production. Now look what this then does. The original selling price in this marketplace was £10. And when the selling price was £10, the market was 22 in size. So 22 units of output were bought and sold in this marketplace. But what we can then see is that when we introduce this £6 per unit tax, the price will grow in the market to £15. At that new equilibrium price of £15, the new quantity being bought and sold in the market is 20. So the market is shrunk, if you like, by 2. Remember, taxes can be used to discourage consumption in markets, and you can see the impact this has had. Okay, now what I can then do is to show you the tax that is paid in this marketplace. So what we would know is that the tax per unit, let me just show you this in a different colour, is the vertical distance between the supply curves, and we know that is £6. And that £6 tax has been paid on all of that £20 of output. Okay, so if you like, if you were calculating the tax paid in this marketplace, we would literally multiply 20, which is how much is bought and sold, by the £6 tax per unit. Now look what I can then show you. If I look at the numbers at the side, This therefore means that the total tax revenue is going to be £120. That is literally that 20, which is the output in the market, multiplied by the tax per unit. Now what we can then do though is to shade in this tax revenue area. So the idea will be that that is the tax revenue generated in this marketplace. Remember, it's the £20, it's the £6 multiplied by the 20 units of output bought and sold. What we can then do is to calculate the incidence of tax. Who is it that is paying the tax in this marketplace? Right, so what we can now do, and again I'll use a different colour to illustrate this, I can show you the tax paid by the consumer first of all. Now of that total shaded area, the green area now is showing us the consumer tax paid. Now look what the consumer is paying. They're paying the increase in price. So the price has grown from £10 up to £15. So they're paying £5 of that tax. And that will apply to all 20 units of output that they buy in this marketplace. So 5 lots of 20 will give us £100. Now the orange box at the bottom would show you the tax that the business will pay. So look what we've got. The business is paying the remaining proportion of that tax. So they will pay £1 unit tax on every unit of output they sold over that 20 units of output. So the producer will pay £20 of tax. Now hopefully what you notice here is that if I add together the consumer tax £100 with the producer tax of £20, we get the total tax revenue paid, £120. Now what I could then do, I could be really clever and we could look at the incidence of tax as a percentage of the tax. So look at the numbers at the bottom of the page. Well, we can see here then that the consumer is paying £100 out of 120 of the total tax paid. So I could work out the percentage of the overall tax paid by the consumer. 100 divided by £120 times 100 comes to 83.3%. But the producer therefore pays the remaining £20, which works out to be £16.7. And hopefully what you're noticing here is that this time the incidence of tax is mainly the consumer paying it. In this example here, the consumer is paying the bulk of this tax. Now you've got to be thinking, well, why is this the case? Well, the case is this time that the consumer has got a price inelastic demand curve. Now look, we've got them. I've got here the calculation of the price elasticity of demand. So remember the formula, percent change in demand divided by percentage change in price. Now what I know is the demand falls from 22 to 20, so there's a 9.1% fall in demand. The price increases from £10 to £15, which is a 50% increase in price. So the PED, well, look at that. It's coming out to be minus 0.182. So I've got a very price inelastic demand curve. Right, well, all that's happening here is ultimately this particular consumer has got a very inelastic demand. So because of that, the business knows that when they increase the selling price, it will have a very low impact on the consumer, its demand for the product. People's demand is unresponsive to a change in price. So when demand's really, really price inelastic, the producer feels comfortable passing on that tax increase to the consumer. So the consumer will bore or pay the majority of that tax. Okay, so when demand's inelastic, the tax will mainly be paid by the consumer. Now let's contrast that now with a price elastic demand. Let's look at this time. The demand curve is much flatter this time. Now again, let's do some of the things that we were doing before. Now remember, the vertical distance between the supply curves shows us the tax per unit. Now this time the tax per unit is going to be £5. There is a £5 tax per unit being placed on this particular product. So I'm just going to write that there. £5 tax per unit. Now again, what we can show with this then as well is the total tax paid in the marketplace. So let me just get rid of some of these different things. So remember, tax revenue for the government will be that shaded orange area there. Now think about why this is the case. The vertical distance between the supply curves is the tax per unit. So 10 all the way down to 5 is the tax per unit, that £5 that's coming out there. In this marketplace now, at the new equilibrium point, 5 units of output will be bought and sold. So 5 times 5 will give us that shaded area, and that will in total give us £25. So the tax paid in the marketplace is £25. But now look at the difference that we've got. What we know is the top proportion of the tax is the tax paid by the consumer. Look what we see here now. The tax paid by the consumer is the increase in price. So the original market equilibrium price was £9. It's now grown to £10. That's £1. And that will be applied to all 5 units of output that they buy. So the consumer will now pay £5 out of that total tax of £25. But the producer, all these guys are paying, is the remaining amount. Now this time this is quite significant. They will pay £4 per unit, so the difference, the remaining amount, multiplied by the 5 units of output that are bought and sold in this marketplace. So hopefully what you notice this time then, that the tax paid in total, the incidence will mainly fall with the producer. They're going to pay 20 out of £25. So everyone remember, if you add together the consumer tax and the producer tax, we get the total tax paid in the market. Now again, the incidence of tax I can show by the bottom row in this table. The consumer was paying £5 out of the £25 generated. Well, 5 divided by 25 times 100 shows that the consumer is paying 20% of the tax. The producer is paying the remaining 80% of the tax. Now look at this then. When demand was very inelastic, it was the consumer who paid the bulk of the tax. Well, this time it's going to be the producer who will have to pay the bulk of the tax. Now the reason is it's linked to price elasticity of demand again. So again, look at the numbers. You've got in the table this calculation to work out the price elasticity of demand. So again, we've got the formula, percent change in demand divided by percentage change in price. If we then plug the numbers into it, we see that demand falls from 15 to 5. So new equilibrium quantity is 5 compared to the older 15. But that is a 66.7% drop in the demand for this product. The price has only grown by £1. It's gone from £9 to £10. Well, that is a 11.1% increase in price. So when I plug the numbers into the PED formula this time, we can see that the PED is coming out at -6. Now look at that. This time, because demand is so elastic, the businesses in the market know that consumers are really responsive to that change in price. And they know that if they were to raise prices too much, then ultimately it would have a significant impact on the market. The demand would plummet massively. So this time the firm is really, really reluctant to raise prices. They know that that consumers are not prepared to pay much of an increase in price. So this time the producer will have to absorb a big proportion of that cost in the marketplace. Right, let me show you this now. Right, now what we therefore know then is that when demand is inelastic, it's going to have to be the consumer that pays the bulk of the tax. So when demand's inelastic, the producer knows that they can get away with passing on a big proportion of that tax onto the consumer. They will only pay a tiny sliver of that tax. When demand is really price elastic in demand, the firm will be really reluctant to pass on that additional cost to the consumer. So they will absorb as much of it as they can. Okay, so guys, when demand's price inelastic in the first diagram, the incidence of tax will be the consumer will pay the vast majority of the tax. When demand is very price elastic in demand, it will be the producer that will pay the majority of the tax. So the idea will be, everyone, that the more price inelastic demand is, the more of the tax will be paid by the consumer. The more price elastic in demand the product is, the more of it will be paid by the producer. Right, I just want to show you one more example of this. Right, now what we've got here now is something which appears a bit more complicated, because I can use this diagram to show all sorts of weird and wonderful different things. Now again, let's do the same thing from before. Again, the vertical distance between the supply curves will show us the tax per unit. So here, what I've got, let me do that in a different colour. We've got a tax per unit of £3.50. That is the vertical distance between the supply curves. What we know is this would therefore generate this area of tax revenue for the government. What we then know is that the consumer will pay this top proportion of tax, and the producer will pay the green area of tax. And if I add together the consumer and the producer tax here, we get the total tax revenue for the government. So the orange area is worth £14. It's the increase in price, £8 to £10, multiplied by the 7 units of output bought in the market. And the producer will pay the remaining £1.50 of tax per unit, multiplied by the 7 units of output bought and sold in the marketplace. Now, if I then work out the incidence of tax at the bottom, we can see this time the consumer will pay 57.1% of the tax, and the producer will pay the remaining 42.9% of the tax. Now, this must mean that the demand for this product is slightly price inelastic in demand, with the reason being the consumer is paying a little bit more of the tax than what the producer is. Okay? But now what we can also do with this diagram, though, is to show the impacts on consumer and producer surplus. So let me make all of these boxes blank again. Right, now what we know is, at the original equilibrium point, that is the area of the original consumer surplus. That is the gap between what people are willing and able to pay and what they do end up paying in the marketplace. We then know that the original producer surplus was that. So the orangey area there. Well, the idea is here, the producer used to generate surplus, which was the gap between the market price and their original supply curve. Right, well, here's the thing. What we now know is that the new equilibrium point is at a different place. So let's make these boxes blank again. So what happens now then is the new consumer surplus is going to be that, the gap between the new market equilibrium price and the demand curve. So what you'll notice is the consumer surplus has fallen significantly. It used to be all of that, but now it's that. Well, look at the producer surplus as well. The new producer surplus is literally that yellow area there. So this has fallen as well. The firms used to have that, which is a much bigger triangle than what they now have. So what we know then as well is that when we introduce an indirect tax into a marketplace, it will have a significant impact on the level of consumer and producer surplus in the marketplace. Okay, so you would argue overall that it would lower the welfare of people in the market. Let me give you one final example of this. Look at this one here. Right, so again, what we've got here is a specific tax, and the vertical distance between the supply curves will show us the tax per unit. Right, now this time we've got a £5 tax per unit. Now again, what we know is that the tax revenue generated for the government will be this area here. So what we know is that the new equilibrium point, the tax per unit is £5. That is multiplied by the 5 that's demanded in the marketplace. So 5 lots of £5 will give us £25. But what we can see this time though is that the tax paid, so the orange is the tax paid by the consumer. The consumer is this time paying £12.50 of the tax. Well, that must mean that the producer is paying the remaining £12.50. So this time the tax is being split equally between the consumer and the producer. Right, look what that then means at the bottom. I'll just unclear these boxes again. Now the bottom row shows the incidence of tax, and this time we can see the tax has been split equally between the consumer and producer. They're both paying 50%. Now remember, when demand was priced inelastic, the tax was paid mainly by the consumer. When the demand was elastic, it was paid mainly by the producer. Well, when we've got a situation where the consumer and producer are splitting the tax equally, it must mean that the demand is price unitary. And look at this, we can see this with these numbers. The original demand was 10, it's fallen to 5. We've got a 50% reduction in the market size. The price has gone from £5 to £7.50 in the marketplace. So that is a 50% increase in price. So we've here got a score of -1 from the PED formula, which is price unitary in demand. So clearly when demand is price unitary, the tax will be split equally between the consumer and the producer. Right everyone, what I would like you to think about now are some different questions. I've thrown at you a heck of a lot of theory just there. So I would like to think about question 3 first of all, showing diagrams the incidence of tax when demand is price inelastic, price elastic, and price unitary, and then reflect on who will pay the most tax when demand is either inelastic or elastic. So you're going to be thinking again about that idea of the incidence of tax. Right, then I want you to think about these questions. Now, I've not been through this, but I want to see what you can do, and we'll be looking at this one together in class. Draw an inward shift in supply to show the impacts of an indirect tax. Could you show me the impacts on the revenue of firms when we introduce these taxes into the marketplace? Okay, so have a go at this question as well. So what you'll need to do, everyone, is to pause to see question 3. Write down your answers. When you're comfortable, hit play. Look at question 4, hit pause there, and once you're happy that you've answered all these questions satisfactorily, everyone, you will have finished the video. So thank you very much for watching.